You are listening to the Centropic Oracle, an audiobook podcast of science fiction and fantasy short stories that make you think and feel. Dueling Ground by Frank Oreto. He always called at night. I never knew what he'd say.
My wife got fat. I think I like it.
The music of the South still colored his voice, years after my own accent had faded. The calls came late, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., when a man thinks his hidden thoughts. I called him, too.
Hello?
His sleepy voice would say. My turn to talk. My marriage is over. Or just, it's snowing. Or, I'm happy. Memories of those calls come to me now faded and out of order. Except for the last one, a month ago. His voice tired and full of grim acceptance.
The marks are back,
he said. I knew exactly what he meant. The beginning is also clear. It was decades past, but I still feel the fear, the rage, and the strange joy. I call up that memory, and I am drunk with it. I wasn't paying attention. If I had, things would have turned out differently. If I'd seen it coming, the old habits would have kicked in. Keep your head down, don't make waves. My body was walking to Algebra 2, but my mind was with Shelley Pruitt. She had come back from summer vacation with the curves of a woman and spent first period smiling at me. I hadn't worked up the nerve to talk to her, but in my overheated daydreams, we had rounded second base and were heading flat out for third. I turned a corner and found a face inches from mine. Not Shelley's, but a boy's. His eyes full of that Lord of the Flies madness you see so often in high schools. A heavy fist slammed down on my books. They tumbled to the dirty tiles, and he gave out a whoop as primitive as any caveman's. I knew him. You knew everyone in a town like Hope's Rest. Eddie Creason was football and vocational courses. I was fantasy novels and the gifted program. Our social roles were not clear-cut as that year's John Hughes film would have you believe, but we knew our parts. I pick up my books and go to class. Eddie turns his attention to new victims. That's not what happened. I forgot my role. Maybe it was Shelley. A smile from a pretty girl can be a powerful thing. My hand shot out and I pinned Eddie to the cement block wall as neat as any bug on display. He sputtered, too shocked to move. I let him go, gathered my books, and walked into algebra. Half the class was staring at me with awe. Word spread. By third period, things were already out of control. I don't like your face, Eddie said. We were in Miss Seaver's English class. I looked up, but didn't say a word. I wasn't scared. Okay, that's not true, but fear wasn't all that froze me to my seat. I didn't know what to do. I'd never been in this situation, so I waited. He could have pressed things, taken a swing at me where I sat. I think I wasn't the only one feeling fear that day. This wasn't a David and Goliath thing. My father had a home gym in our basement. I'd never liked team sports, too unsure of myself, but weights were different. There was no team to disappoint. It was only me versus a barbell loaded with iron plates. I spent as much time moving weight in that basement as I did reading Tolkien and Gene Wolfe in my bedroom. It turned me from a fat, bookish kid into a muscular but still bookish teen. Bullies usually steered clear of me, the idea of a hulking nerd too unknown a quantity. Maybe Eddie was braver than most, or more likely too full of adrenaline at the time to care, but now he'd had time to think. I'd never been in a fight, but Eddie didn't know that. All he had to base his opinion on were shoulders, biceps, and the way I'd pinned him against that wall. In your seat, Mr. Creason, Miss Seaver said, and the moment was gone. On my way to the lockers, people slapped me on the back and smiled. Some crossed the line from silent support to outright handicapping. Mike Pratt, racing stallion. That was me. It's going to be a good fight, Jim Holland said and gave my shoulder an appraising squeeze. You got about 10 pounds on him, but Eddie has the experience. I shook off his hand without comment. David Nipper, my best friend, fell in beside me. He was fat and had a bowl haircut, yet somehow he'd achieved an easy popularity. I think I'm about to get my head caved in. David looked at me. Okay, here's what you do. You kick his ass. He saw the annoyance on my face but went on. Seriously. He grabbed my arm and shook it. You're a monster. I pulled away. God, not you too. I've felt like a 4-H show bull ever since the whole Eddie thing got started. People are making bets. This is what I'm saying. It's not just you and Eddie anymore. It was too public. Eddie can't let it go. You can't either. People are counting on you. What people? The gifted program? Beta club? Some Neanderthal wants to pound my face in, that's all. David shook his head. You're wrong. It is for Beta Club. At least it's for all the people that asshole ever knocked down. You stood up to Eddie Creason. Now you have to show it was the right move by, kicking the shit out of him. If it's so important, why don't you fight him? David sighed. It's going to happen, Mike. You need to get it over with. Eddie made another run for me at lunch. I stood at the top of the short stairway that ran the length of the cafeteria. I might as well have been on stage. We gonna do this chicken shit? I could smell lunchroom pizza on his breath. I didn't want to fight, not on behalf of the oppressed or to prove how strong I was. I wanted to go home. The lot, I said. What? Eddie's mouth twisted into a tough guy snarl, but something else was in his eyes. A look that said, please don't do this. The lot, Saturday, 10 a.m. I didn't say it loud. I didn't have to. The lunchroom had gone high noon quiet. Eddie nodded, and the silence exploded into 100 conversations. Is there a problem here, boys? Mr. Williams, the science teacher, stepped between us, clapping a hand on each of our shoulders. He was a big man with a head like a cement block, an old pro at spotting trouble. No, sir, Eddie said. Just going to my locker. Mr. Williams let Eddie go and turned to me. My knees felt weak, and for a moment the big teacher's grip was all that held me up. Mike, you all right? Worry peeked past his stern expression. Did you eat lunch? I nodded without hearing the question. Okay. If you feel sick, you go to the nurse's office. I heard him that time. I'm fine. I wandered back to my locker. David was waiting. The lot? He asked. What the hell is wrong with you? You wanted me to fight him. I'm going to fight him. Here, dumbass, with that thyroid case, Mr. Williams 10 feet away. You'd get a couple of good shots in, maybe black Eddie's eye, then Williams breaks it up. 10 minutes of lectures and it's all over except for the awkward handshake. Why didn't you say that earlier? I thought you knew. It's high school 101. Jesus, for someone in the gifted program, you're pretty damn stupid. You can't fight in the lot. That place is a dueling ground. Shit gets out of control there. Real worry filled David's face. It was contagious. I didn't go to the nurse that day, but I was sick. I'd made a mistake. I had wanted to put things off. Now I was going to the lot. Jesus. Despite being the county seat, Hope's Rest wasn't much more than a wide spot in a narrow road. We had 3 traffic lights, 1 restaurant, a half-dozen assorted churches, and the lot. I think the telephone co-op owned it because there were wooden poles stacked in neat heaps along the lot's edges, perfect for stadium seating. Otherwise it was empty, a barren plain of gravel, broken glass, and chunks of cement. I'd ridden by it countless times on my bike and never seen anyone working there. Nothing seemed to happen in the lot, except the fights. Not that I'd seen any. I didn't need to. Those fights were Hope's Rest high mythology, a mixture of exaggeration and hearsay, and of course our gospel truth. We all told the stories. Remember a couple of years ago when Roy Schaap fought the Freeman brothers? This was black football hero versus redneck bruisers. Johnny pulled that knife, god damn, but Roy was tough. Even cut, he managed to break Billy's arm before Billy and his shit-kicker brother ran off. Or, did you hear about Jim DeBoard and Tony Worthington? Jim kicked Tony in the balls and then broke his nose. Jim's sister sat on a cinder block with a gun in her hand the whole time so nobody would jump in. Anyone in school could have given you those blow-by-blow accounts, but asked if we'd been there, we'd have shrugged and said, no, but everybody knows. There were darker stories, the details lost in a past where 4 years equaled a lifetime. We all knew people had died in the lot, even if we couldn't give you a name. A kid broke a bottle and stuck it into some other kid's neck. You could still see the blood on the gravel if you knew where to look. School was okay the next day. The date was set, so Eddie left me alone. By invoking the lot, I'd made the fight a sacred event, something spoken of in respectful whispers. But at night, I had ugly dreams, my mind a swirl of blood, pain, and an excitement that shamed me. Thursday after school, I got on my bike and rode. I didn't have a plan, but some part of me knew where I was going. In the dark sky above me, thunder rumbled deep-voiced threats. No stop at Standifer Drug for barbecue corn chips and a peek at the comics. I bumped over the railroad tracks and pedaled out past the feed store, then stopped. The lot was empty, of course. An escaped shaft of sunlight made the broken glass sparkle, gem-like in the gravel. A steel cable ran along the perimeter, threaded through short metal rods at the corners. Not a barrier, a boundary. I propped my bike on its side, stepped over the cable, and into the lot. I kicked a piece of gravel and searched for bloodstains. When I looked up, I wasn't alone. Eddie Creason sat on a wooden pole on the lot's opposite side. Maybe he'd been there all along. I didn't question it. Waves of glorious relief washed my mind clean of any questions. It was over. The worry and nightmares done. My hands curled into fists. I'd seen crime shows where the criminal wanted to be caught. I understood that now. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wanted to get it over with. Eddie came toward me, his arms up. "Come on!" I yelled. It wasn't about anyone else now. No crowd to cheer us on. No girl with a gun to keep things honest. No distractions at all. My relief transformed into a kind of joyous rage. It was nothing I had felt before, but it was right. This feeling is what you came to the lot for. The misery I'd endured that week, the fear, it was all Eddie's fault. My fingers itched with the need to make him pay. The distance closed. I swung upward, putting my weight behind the punch more by instinct than skill. My fist sank deep into Eddie's gut. His breath hissed from between clenched teeth. A moment later, bony knuckles slammed into my ear, and the world filled with ringing bells. I shook my head and found Eddie. His face was only inches away. I brought my forehead down hard on his nose. Bone crunched, and Eddie fell back on his ass. The lot had no rules, gave no quarter, and I was wholly a creature of the lot now. I swung my foot at Eddie's head. I wanted to kick the goddamn thing off his shoulders. Eddie's forearm caught my shin. He rolled back, pulling my leg along with him, and slammed his foot up into my crotch. I stumbled back. Waves of sickness washed over me. I didn't fall, but it was a close thing. Eddie stood, his nose a mass of blood. In his hand, he clutched a jagged chunk of cinder block. "Good," I said through my pain. In my mind, that piece of cement wasn't a danger. It was permission. Now I could kill the son of a bitch. Eddie took a step toward me and stopped. He stared at something behind me, his eyes wide. It was the oldest trick in the book, and if I hadn't fallen for it, I would be dead now, or in prison. I turned my head and saw it too. The thing was massive. Its meaty, misshapen cylinder of a body stood as high as my head. Black legs, shiny with mucus or oil, jutted from beneath it at wrong angles. Wiry-haired antennae sprouted from the thing in patches. I could have denied my eyes. I had someone to kill. That need ruled me. But I not only saw the thing, I felt it. One of the thing's grotesque antennae hovered less than a foot from me. It was feeding. I felt it sucking away some part of me like the business end of a vacuum cleaner held too near my skin. I ran. I got 3 yards before I almost slammed into another one of the creatures. They were all around. This one was not as long as the first. I dodged around the thing's front and fell. Half of me still trying to run, the other half frozen in shock. There was no head. The creature just ended, sliced off as clean as a diagram in a biology book. Inside was a viscous purple jelly, full of worm-like tendrils and spherical sacs pulsing and sliding along each other like things you'd see in pond water through a microscope. I got my feet back under me and kept running. I reached the cable boundary before Eddie screamed. He stood in the center of the lot, the creatures all around him. A diseased-looking antenna held Eddie fast by the shoulder. He had attacked the damn things. I was convinced of it, and I was furious. You run from monsters. If ever there was a law of human nature, that was it. The words echoed in my mind as I broke that law and ran back into the lot. I wanted to leave Eddie behind, but I couldn't, not to those things. I tackled him low, right at the hips. The antenna resisted, then tore from the creature's body, trailing purple ichor from the stump. I got to my knees and ripped the antenna from Eddie's bloody shoulder. Tiny suckers covered it, each sucker boasting a thin, curved hook in its center. The creatures were everywhere now. We ran for the gaps, the shorn-off parts where the things just ended, Eddie pulling me behind him. Something stronger than Eddie pulled back. Another antenna, this one as thick as a sapling, wrapped itself around my waist. I felt the suckers latch onto me, followed by the bite of those needle-thin teeth. I burned, my mind swimming with pain and foreign sensations. This was not only an attack, it was communication. The thing, only one creature I knew now, was more than an animal. It possessed a strange and terrible intelligence. I don't believe it tried to talk to me, but when we touched, I knew things. It wasn't just here. Parts of it were elsewhere, elsewhen, and wherever those parts were, they fed. I saw flashes, grim-faced men on a grassy field hacking at each other with crude swords, kids my age crouched in an alley firing snub-nosed revolvers. A man and woman wrestling and yelling obscenities in a filthy kitchen until the woman forced a carving knife into the soft flesh of the man's neck. All those places were like the lot. They drew violence like metal shavings to a magnet because they were this creature's feeding grounds. The thing stoked rage and bloodlust, then lapped up the emotions like a cat laps cream. We weren't supposed to have seen it. I knew that too. It should have existed outside of our senses. If Eddie and I had kept to the plan, we'd have fought in the middle of a mob of school kids screaming for blood. Instead, we were alone, with no distractions, and somehow Eddie had noticed the thing. Eddie, not me. I'd let the rage take over. Hell, I'd enjoyed it. It was Eddie who stepped back and saw what was happening. I realized then he hadn't wanted to fight. That's how he was able to see the thing. I was the bad guy here. But it didn't matter now. We'd seen this creature and it meant to destroy us. It needed to feed secretly, siphoning off the rage that sustained it. The thing was a lamprey, not a shark. Eddie still gripped my hand. His eyes went from the fleshy antenna around me to my face, searching for direction. Or was it permission? I gave it to him. You run from monsters, I said through gritted teeth. Eddie let go of my hand. I turned and slammed my fists into the creature's side. The antenna poured pain into me, but I still had the rage. If that was what it fed on, I'd make it choke. Behind me, Eddie howled. I kicked at one of the black legs. The whole creature shivered, but not from my attack. Eddie yelled again, and I realized it wasn't from pain or fear. The antenna that wrapped around me jerked and loosened. I flung myself away. Eddie stood at one of the creature's bisected ends, his arms thrust into the thing up to his shoulders. Ragged baseball-sized lumps of purple ooze spilled onto the ground. I jumped to my feet, forgetting the pain, and ran to Eddie's side. The thing's guts were scalding hot and gave off waves of pain. We ignored it and dug deeper. My hand found something long and gristle-tough. I dug in with my fingernails and pulled. A blue tube of meat and pulsing veins fell in coils to the ground. The creature convulsed. A ragged burst of emotion came off it. The thing was screaming. Its body rose and fell like a cracked whip, throwing me to the ground. Eddie held on, one hand inside, the other clutching one of the thing's legs. I got back to my feet and speared my hand back inside. Eddie bellowed and shoved his other arm in the gaping hole we'd dug. "I got something," he said. "Help me!" My hand found the same object, a large membranous sac. The sac flexed, trying to pull itself deeper inside. The creature jerked again, lifting us off our feet. We didn't let go. "Ready?" Eddie said. "Pull!" I yanked with all the strength I had left. There was a horrible, wet, tearing sound. Our prize fell to the gravel. A 3-foot-wide ball of translucent, wet flesh. Inside, tiny shapes crawled over each other, pulsing with the colors of a diseased rainbow. A brain, I thought? An egg sac? "Balls!" Eddie yelled and brought a heavy engineer boot down onto the glowing sack. "We got one of its freaking balls!" I slammed my own foot down, grinding the glowing things beneath my heel. There was a clap like thunder, the sound of air collapsing in on a suddenly empty space. The creature was gone. Our feet pounded onto bare gravel as we turned in circles, searching for an enemy that wasn't there. "Shit," Eddie said and sat on the gravel. My adrenaline-fired strength turned to water, and I sank down beside the boy I'd wanted to kill minutes before. "Is it coming back?" Eddie asked, as if making honor roll gave me insight into the habits of monsters. I shook my head. "Nah," I said. "We stomped its balls." I started to laugh. Eddie joined me. Soon we were rolling on the ground, lost in the joy of still being alive. There was a roar of thunder, the sky laughing along, and the rain that had threatened all day poured down on us. The laughter ran out and we stood and looked at each other, the rain running in pink streams from our bleeding faces. "What about Saturday?" I asked. Eddie seemed confused for a moment, and then let loose a bark of laughter. "Are you kidding me?" He stuck out his hand, and I took it. The handshake was not awkward at all. At home, I told my parents I'd had a bike wreck, a slide in the rain. My mother soaked the sucker marks she took for road rash in antiseptic and put an ice pack on my eye. Best of all, she didn't ask any difficult questions. At school, people saw the bruises and made their assumptions. When asked, I said that Eddie and I had settled our problems. Eddie must have said something close to the same. I didn't know for sure because I avoided Eddie like the plague. I wanted to believe the thing we'd fought in the lot had been a dream. Seeing Eddie made it real, so I tried like hell not to see him. The call, the first one, came 2 weeks later. The phone rang at 11. I woke in time to hear it stop. A minute later, my father stood in the doorway of my room. "There's a boy on the phone who wants to talk to you," he said. "I think he's drunk." It was Eddie, and he was drunk. More importantly, his friends were drunk too. They'd driven up the mountain to the fire tower and split a case of Miller Lite. The friends decided to drive back to town. When Eddie said they were too drunk, they left him behind with a wave and a squeal of rubber. My father watched me listen to Eddie's story, a question in his eyes. "I need to give somebody a ride." He nodded, and I got the sense I'd passed a test. Eddie smelled like beer and vomit when we picked him up. In the well-kept farmhouse we drove him to, a man waited in a straight-backed chair. He wore overalls and a Bible lay open on his lap. He wasn't a big man, but he looked hard, as if he'd been carved from oak rather than born. The man looked up from his Bible, his eyes weighing each of us in turn. "Edward, you go to your room," he said, and Eddie went. Without thinking, I followed. I could hear the low voices of our fathers behind us. Eddie sat on his bed and stared into space. "I walked by the lot a few days ago," I said. "There was a truck there loading telephone poles. You think we killed it, or at least chased it away?" Eddie shrugged. "It felt different," I said. "Not as bad." "You have nightmares?" he asked. I told him yes, and asked him if drinking helped. "No," he said, and laid on the mattress, his boots still on. A moment later, he slept. I looked around the small room. Sports pennants hung on the walls along with pictures. Eddie's father looking younger and softer than he did now, his arm around a plump, smiling woman. Eddie standing in front of the happy couple in a Little League uniform or football pads. Other photos contained only father and son, both older, the smiles gone. "Mike, we should go," my own father called. I nodded to the man in the chair as we left and followed my father out to the car. "You and that boy have matching bruises," Dad said, taking the mountain curves with practiced ease. "Makes me wonder who won." "We did," I said. High school was almost 30 years ago. I left Hope's Rest the day after graduation and never looked back. I came home for holiday functions, then family funerals, and then there was nothing left to come home for. Until now. Hope's Rest hasn't changed. I drove to the churchyard with no need of directions.
"The marks are back. Doc's calling it cancer, but you and I know better."
Those were Eddie's last words. No long goodbyes, no "I'll miss you." We still weren't friends, not really. We were something more than that. At least 30 people stood by his grave. Eddie died too young, and that always brings out a crowd. I stood at the back, my hand touching my stomach where the creature had marked me all those years before. My marks had healed, and at least for now, hadn't come back. The preacher had already had his say. I listened to the sniffles and quiet sobs, and I joined in loud when they sang "Mansion Over the Hilltop." Then it was over, and I made my way back to the car. A hand touched my shoulder. "Do I know you?" asked a soft voice. I turned and looked at her. "I knew Eddie," I said. "We went to school together." In a way, I knew her also. She was short and plump, about my age. The face was sad, but the lines at the corners of her mouth and eyes told of a life spent smiling. I remembered those pictures in Eddie's room so many years ago. He'd married his mother. "You must be Eddie's wife. I've heard a lot about you."
"My wife got fat. I like it."
"You're the one he always called," she said, and her voice broke into the bright smile that must normally have dwelt there. Then it faltered. "My God, it's true, isn't it?" I nodded. Her face reddened. "We had fights over you. He'd never talk about it. I thought you must be some old girlfriend." She shook her head. "Why did he call you?" I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what Eddie and I were? We'd been each other's witness to the impossible. After that, nothing seemed quite real without that witness. I sighed, too old to worry about sounding crazy. "Once upon a time," I said, "we fought a monster."
We hope you enjoyed Dueling Ground by Frank J. Oreto, read by Larissa Thompson. If you'd like to learn more about the author and narrator of this story or make a donation to them, follow the story page link in the description. If you would like to submit a story for consideration or apply to be a narrator, a link to our submission guidelines is in the description. This story is copyrighted 2020 by the Centropic Oracle.